NAR just released an updated deadline in which the policy changes from the settlement will go into effect, and that deadline is August 17th. Now, there was preliminary court approval of the settlement on April 23rd, and NAR released this updated date. There was talk before about it being in July. Now it's August 17th. And then NAR also released some more information regarding the policy changes. And now I'm looking at their website. I'm going through it. I'll skim it briefly and talk about what these changes are, but this is the latest and most reliable information in terms of what's happening as this settlement materializes into a firm policy that goes into effect August 17th. Okay, so the first is eliminate and prohibit any requirement of offers of compensation in the MLS between listing brokers or sellers to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives. We know this. The offer of compensation is going to be eliminated. It also says that this is another policy, so it's not a complete sentence. They just say retain and define cooperation for MLS participants. I only think that this is just updating what to cooperate means, whereas cooperation in the past or historically means that there's an offer of compensation from the listing broker to the buyer's broker. That's going to be revised to omit any sort of offer of compensation. Okay, the next policy change listed on their website. Eliminate and prohibit MLS participants, subscribers, and sellers from making any offers of compensation in the MLS to buyer broker or other buyer representatives. This is effectively eliminating the ability for a listing agent to put in agent remarks any offer of compensation. So it can't be written anywhere else on there. It's not just that the MLS is going to get rid of the buyer compensation field. There can't be any mention of it by the listing agent. Okay, next, require the MLS to eliminate all broker compensation fields and compensation MLS in the MLS. Okay, more of the same. This is overlapping. These are just blanket statements saying, listen, any way you look at it, there cannot be an offer of compensation to a buyer's representative. Require the MLS to not create, facilitate, or support any non-MLS mechanism for participants, subscribers, or sellers to make offers of compensation to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives. This means the MLS can't create some sister site or a related database that does have buyer agent compensation. Because in theory, if it's removed, if buyer agent compensation is removed from the MLS, well, couldn't there just be a affiliated database, or couldn't there be some other website that agents can list how much they're offering to a buyer's agent? Well, the MLS can't in any way participate in anything like that. And it even goes on with this next rule. Prohibit the use of MLS data or data feeds to directly or indirectly establish or maintain a platform of offers of compensation from multiple brokers to other buyer representatives. Okay, same idea, but it's saying, listen, not only can the MLS not publish it on the MLS itself, but the MLS cannot have a sister site or supposedly unrelated site to the MLS that does have offers of compensation. There can be no offer of compensation database. And the use of MLS data, so the MLS can't even sidestep it and say, no, we just have a data feed going to Zillow, and now Zillow is the database where everyone looks up buyer agent compensation. The MLS cannot participate in that. If Zillow or some large national consumer interface of MLS data, because that's what Realtor.com and Redfin and Zillow, all of them are just a hodgepodge of MLS data fields going into one aggregated repository and then being syndicated through a consumer interface. That's why when you look on Zillow, it looks very clean. You can jump from state to state, but it's MLS data being aggregated from multiple sources. Well, in theory, Zillow could step forward and say, hey, we have an opportunity here. We can now just publish the buyer's agent compensation, and agents will have to use us. Every agent will have to get a profile, and that's where they're going to be able to talk about compensation from the listing broker to the buyer's agent. They don't have to do it on the MLS anymore. They can use a private third-party site. Well, the problem is, because MLS or Realtor.com or name any other consumer site like that, because they're getting data from the MLS, the data cannot participate in any sort of scheme like that. The MLS cannot furnish data to a company that's knowingly creating a offer of compensation database. This boils down to just more of the idea of eliminating any offer of compensation. So the MLS can't even try to sidestep it. This is closing any loophole for the MLS to participate in an outside offer of compensation database. Let's go on to the next one. Reinforce that MLS participants and subscribers must not, and MLSs must not, enable the ability to filter out or restrict MLS listings that are communicated to customers or clients based on the existence or level of compensation offered to the cooperating broker or name of the brokerage or agent. This is a bit of a reach. I don't even know how you would enforce this, but with the eradication of an offer of compensation, this is almost pointless. This is just saying that there can't be any sort of streamlined way to filter out listings in which an offer of compensation is not present. Because if you're going to eliminate an offer of compensation, if one listing is able to offer some sort of compensation, which shouldn't even take place because of all these other rules, well, all listings should be equal, they're saying. There shouldn't be any listing filtration system that allows listings where there's some sort of subtle offer, or I don't even know how they would make an offer if the last rules we were reading were just multiple ways of eliminating any possible offer of compensation. And this rule is saying, well, even if there is an offer of compensation indirectly, there should be no filtration that allows agents to sift through and only cherry pick listings offering compensation. Now, what comes to mind as I'm explaining this is when I was on the brokers web forum meeting that we had, there was a webinar from the largest MLS in the country. They were talking about a field for a seller concession, because sellers make concessions on a considerable amount of listings already. Sellers make concessions in terms of typically a credit toward the buyer's closing costs is a prime example. Another example would be maybe a credit toward a repair. Either way, it's a credit. The seller is making a concession by issuing a credit. Now, that credit doesn't just necessarily have to go exclusively to the buyer. What if that credit is to the buyer's agent? Here's another one. If a buyer must sign a broker agreement, a broker representation agreement with their agent, and the buyer's on the hook for a commission. So in the future, and you'll see this with this last rule I'm going to read, all buyers working with realtors are going to have a financial obligation to their agent in the future. That's what's happening August 17th. You better have a buyer representation agreement in place. Now, if a buyer's on the hook for that, that's another obligation, financial obligation for the buyer, just like closing costs. So why could a seller concession not just go to the buyer to help offset the burden of their commission? And as it stands now, the chief workaround is going to be that seller concession field in the MLS. Now, this filtration rule could be talking about that, meaning that there can't be a way to filter listings that are offering a seller concession versus listings that aren't. That's the only way this rule makes sense to me with what I know so far. Because in theory, agents could say, unless there's a seller concession being offered from the outset, I'm not even going to bother with it. That's cherry picking, and that's banned. That's what that rule does. Now, I will say that I've noticed that even now with the MLS, and none of these things have gone into effect, of course, and they won't until August, so don't worry about it in the meantime. I've already been getting lots of questions about what needs to be done and agents worrying about policy. Familiarize yourself with the buyer representation agreement. Use it if you'd like. You're not required to until August, but no changes as it stands. That said, if I go in the MLS now and I try to sort based on commission amount, the MLS will not let me do it. So there may already be a filtration mechanism that is being stopped by the MLS now, because I can't filter by lowest commission, lowest offered compensation. This goes a step further and says if there is any sort of seller concession which could be used to offset the buyer's obligation to pay on the buyer representation agreement, that cannot be filtered out. Hopefully I didn't go too long about this rule, but it should make sense now. All right, just two last ones. Require compensation disclosures to sellers as well as prospective sellers and buyers. Yes, everyone's going to know about compensation after this. This will be baked into all the paperwork that all the parties are going to need to know who's getting paid what and by whom. Of course, this last rule, and I'll expand on this too, it's kind of interesting. So this last rule is require MLS participants working with the buyer to enter into a written agreement, buyer representation agreement, with the buyer prior to touring a property. And as it was said to me on that call, when an agent asked in the Q&A portion of it, at what point exactly constitutes the requirement to have a buyer representation agreement? Does it mean if I'm working the front desk in the office and a buyer calls and wants to make an appointment, I need to immediately shove a buyer representation agreement down their throat? Does that need to happen right then? The answer is no. It's when you're opening the door on your first showing, and they have it written here prior to touring a property. I guess a little bit more of an elegant way of saying prior to opening the first door. That's when you need to have it. Now, on the buyer representation agreement, the buyer's making the commitment of paying the buyer's agent, and that amount is capped so that if a buyer's agent, and I said this on another video before, in theory, that's going to be a negotiated part of a relationship between a buyer and buyer's agent. And so what might buyer's agents do? Well, they'll offer to have the buyer put the absolute lowest amount on a buyer representation agreement and say, hey, I'm the cheapest buyer's agent to work with. If you work with me, I know other agents might want you to write 2.5% on your representation agreement or 2%. I'll just require 0.25% or something absurdly low, a race to the bottom. Here's the thing though, whatever an agent puts on their buyer representation agreement is the max they can get from other parties. So if you put 0.5% or something absurdly low as a buyer's agent to beat out your competition, you're setting yourself in a trap of not being able to get any more commission. That's it. You've capped it yourself. You've created a limitation yourself. So it's important that when you enter into a buyer representation agreement and you have a commission amount, make sure it's a reasonable number because you're going to be stuck with that number. And the buyer should know that there's a possibility they're going to be on the hook for that number. I know that historically, buyer's agents have told buyers, listen, I know we're putting an obligation for you to pay me on this form. Don't worry, I'm going to saddle this bill on someone else, whether it's the listing broker or whether it's the seller. That should not happen. And I know it's historically happened, it shouldn't. The buyer knows that they need to have skin in the game and that they should consider it a bonus if the seller or the listing broker is able to pay. So those are the changes. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.